Welcome to Rainbow Speaks, Rainbow Stage's first ever Rainbow Stage podcast.
Yeah, it's very official.
My name is Cuinn Joseph.
My name is Cuinn Joseph.
And we are your hosts and your soon-to-be best friends.
Yeah.
Or at least for the next hour or so.
so.
Yeah. So Rainbow Stage decided to do this podcast because they wanted to start highlighting some local theater talent, some Manitoba theater talent, some Canada theater talent, and talk about some stories and things going on in a post-pandemic sort of world.
Mm-hmm. And apparently we're the perfect people to do it. So.
According to them, I don't know
why.
But a little bit about us. As I said, my name is Cuinn Joseph. I am a theater creator. I've done professional theater and independent theater, and as an actor and performer and composer and writer. And I'm also a drama teacher.
Wow, he does it all. And I'm Cuinn Joseph. I am also a theater creator, performer, teacher, and I am an arts administrator. I work as the training programs manager at Creative Manitoba.
Woohoo! Yeah, I mean, that's
us. That's Rainbow Speaks. So good night.
No, not yet. No, we have a whole
Right.
episode planned.
Sorry,
Not
sorry.
good night. Yeah, but without further ado,
let's get speaking.
And today's episode is on pandemic pivots.
The year was 2019. The electricity in the air was palpable. Winnipeg theater community was abuzz with brand new artistic directors, up-and-coming independent companies, and the willingness to take artistic risks. This upward momentum was predestined for one thing and one thing only: a global pandemic that devastated healthcare systems, economies, governments, and, unsurprisingly, artistic communities. Those of us who were able to continue working in the arts sector tried to scrape by with live stream productions. We strained our imaginative brains by pretending Zoom was a stage. We wore masks to perform to our audiences, and our audiences wore masks to attend, meaning that they saw performers with half of their faces exposed, only able to act with their eyes and muffled voices, and we saw them with half their faces exposed, staring seemingly unmoved by our every action. For all intents and purposes, theater was dead. I know, we're being a little dramatic, but it's a theater podcast, so what did you expect?
Our art form was struggling to keep up with the ever-changing COVID-19 riddled world. Then, through brilliant human innovation, and subsequently large pharmaceutical companies taking credit for brilliant human innovation, vaccines were created and things started to change. Public spaces started to open up again, auditions were being held, productions were being cast, and eventually we got back to a place like Rainbow Stage on opening night of The Wizard of Oz, an absolutely packed house that was incredibly warm and receptive to a tale about friendship and adventure performed by an entirely Manitoban cast. So, everything was back to normal, and theater was alive and well again, right? Unfortunately, not so simple. Like anything this multifaceted, there's more nuance to the return of theater. There are highs and lows, unexpected twists and turns, complications along the way that require more innovation and more adaptation than ever before. And so, here to talk to us about those highs and lows, as well as their innovation, their adaptation, we are pleased to welcome Rainbow Stage's artistic director, Carson, Nattrass, and Manitoba Theater for Young People's artistic director, Pablo Felices-Luna.
Wow.
Welcome.
What an introduction.
Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
It's so exciting to be in something that is literally one of these pandemic pivots.
Yeah.
Born of the country's and the government's ability to support the arts through this really difficult time. Here we are having a conversation about it. Hopefully moving forward in a really positive way. How you doing there, Pablo?
Well, you talk about here we are and, all of the adjustments we've had to make over the last 2 years. Well, here I am on Zoom because I'm running a bit of a cold, and in our current world, I couldn't join you in the studio. So if that's not like perfect timing for this podcast, I don't know what is.
Pandemic pivots, here we are.
That's
Yeah,
what we're
right?
talking about. But before we get into it, we'd like to talk to you guys about what got you into this role in the first place. Why artistic direction specifically, and kind of how you landed these gigs. I don't know who wants to start. Maybe Pablo, let's start with you.
I first became an artistic director of a different company in Ontario, and I had worked for that company for a number of times as a freelance artist. And I loved the work so much that, my wife and I occasionally would say things like, wouldn't it be great if someday I could do that job? Because I started to get a sense of what it was all about. It was a next step for me in separating my own artistic interest from to something greater, to to actually make things possible for other artists, which really excited me. So when I came to MTYP, which is a larger theater than the one I was at before, I had what I would call a larger sandbox to play in, more opportunities for artists, both local and, we have a presentation series, so we can bring in companies from across the country and all around the world. So for me, that's been the key thing, that there's a draw when you become an artistic director to also facilitate, to create opportunities, to explore the artistic expression of other people in your community, which I love.
It may be difficult to create your journey with musical theater. It takes a lot of hard work. But once you're a part of that family, it is a family. And so when the role came up, when I applied for it, it had become a half-time position, and which I think limited. I'm not trying to downplay my qualifications, but it was it limited to local applicants,
absolutely.
which I think I could probably segue into how I view this theater in terms of being dedicated to Manitobans. I feel really grateful that I've been able to steward the last few years. It's been hard, but that's that. Bless you. I don't know if that
Now brings us
answers
to
your question.
segment called Pablo sneezes.
What's funny is that was a comment.
Oh man, I'm wrong. Different segment. It'll come up
That's
later.
I'm not an actor. My
Hold
choices
on
were
that
not
one, but yeah.
specific enough.
Anyway, yeah, you were saying it was easier to kind of segue into that. It being local was a huge.
Yeah, and I feel very grateful to the previous artistic directors. Well, actually, there's only been, I hope I have my history correct, only 4 artistic directors in the 65 plus years of Rainbow Stage.
Wow.
So, and that's because the role continued to be sort of eliminated and replaced with an executive producer who was promoting essentially commercial theater on a local level. So
Right.
doing American and British musicals. It's like, why do you need an artistic director to be like, let's do Wicked? Like, obviously,
Totally.
right?
Yeah.
And so Ken Peter, who was the executive producer when I began acting here, he had a really strong vision that changed Rainbow for the better. And then after he passed, Ray Hogg really bumped up the professionalism of Rainbow Stage, but also he invested in me as a director. And so I think that was sort of that next step to, and like he really mentored me into what this position could be.
Right. Yeah, those are both wonderful stories. I think kind of to segue into the more pandemic specific part of this episode, something you said, Pablo, that was interesting was the idea of taking your own like artistic vision and your own personal interests and sort of separating that from that of a larger community. And I think that's something that's really I guess I'll say poetic or universal in terms of how a lot of us feel from the pandemic as a whole of for things to get better, it had to be a number of people sacrificing their own personal interests. I'll go ahead and say it. I hate wearing masks. Who wants to wear a mask? But you have to wear a mask if you want to prevent the spread of a virus. And so there's a lot of that give up the individual for the better of the community or the betterment of the community. And I'm sure that comes up a lot in artistic direction specifically of you as an artist might want to do this, this, and this, but as an AD, you're beholden a lot more to, the interests of your subscribers, the interests of your board, and generally just keeping the thing running and alive.
Especially now.
Especially now. So I guess my first question, before we get into more specific pandemic stuff, is: are there things that you think of right off the top of your heads that's like, I've made this sacrifice, this personal vision sacrifice, or has it sort of slotted in nicely where your personal vision of what you thought this was going to be going into the job and what it's become have run in lockstep in a sort of harmonious way?
I don't know about sacrifice per se. I feel like that's a fairly strong word. One of the things that you learn as an artistic director, or that I've learned as an artistic director, is that you're really playing the long game, right? This idea that I really want to do this show, or I really want to work with this director or this actor or this designer. Well, if not now, like the mantra is always maybe next year, right? Like that you can actually think of things. And we certainly, over the pandemic, a lot of artists have looked at work that has been postponed, that has been shelved for a while. But that is intrinsic in programming, right? Like there's times when you really want to do something and you think, well, not this year, maybe next year. So I think that's a subtle distinction. I think more profoundly, Cuinn and Cara, I actually don't think this is about artistic direction. I think it's about the essence of theater. That's my bias. I think theater is ultimately solely about the postponement of the ego, because you're telling someone else's story, right? And that it takes a great act of selflessness. You're both performers. You know what that's like, to lend your body, your soul, your life experience to channel the story that's being told through you. So I think it's harmonious. This idea of we need to rally, we need to do something together, we need to postpone our own interests and desires for the sake of something greater. I think it emanates from the very nature of theater.
So, with that sort of idea of postponing and sort of moving things around and trying to continue with some forward motion, what were some of the setbacks and how do you navigate those within, a theater setting, trying to give people work, trying to keep your theater alive and open and keep audiences engaged even when you're unable to put on something live? What does that look like?
I agree that there's a long game to this role in terms of planning and that it is community based, and your communities are varied. So you want to take care of your acting company, you want to take care of your crew and have them be employed, but you have to take care of your audience and
Right.
and of course your board and like all these elements that I only had I'm not in the worst case scenario of new ADs, as you pointed out in 2019. Like some people didn't even get a season programmed. So I inherited one season. I programmed one successful season and then had the next one canceled. So, and then I would say that I'm still learning. So to answer your questions about these things, I'm like, I can learn from Pablo for sure. But what the long game is, and I would say that the hiatus that was given to us in terms of programming had a lot of blessings from our end. I had a lot of time to learn about who we are, and dedicate myself to how it can serve the community and how we can leave this place better than we found it. That's sort of one piece of it, and the pivoting was exciting at times. I often refer to it as like Sisyphus pushing the boulder to the top of the mountain, like, because we'd be like, oh, we have this great idea. Okay, 6 concerts. Each of them will feature communities and how they tell stories through music and dance. Like, it can't just be North American musical theater. It's like, how do other cultures explore telling stories through music and dance? That's what we do. And it was like, so we identified these 6 concerts that we would do. We applied for a grant, and it all got canceled.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the work was, to me, really worth it. Like, I got introduced to communities and introduced to other companies that we were going to co-produce with. And although it was tragic and so frustrating, each one of those pushes of the boulder to the top of the mountain was really worthwhile. Right. And then some of them are profoundly successful. So to me, we have, musical theater, and I sort of always have to speak through the lens of what we do, right?
Yeah, totally.
So musical theater has this attraction to young people. So when a lot of theaters are fighting to get young audiences, it's not something that I think, this is why I love being on this podcast with Pablo, is like, we don't struggle with finding young audiences.
Right. Yeah.
And I've thought a lot about why it is that teenagers are obsessed with musical theater. And I think it's because you get to sing and dance your feelings and through poetry.
Totally.
Right? And so, like, at the point in which your hormones are taking over, you do not have the words. It's impossible for you to have the words to express how you feel. And we're also in an age where, like, you just send a heart, and that's supposed to mean like a sonnet.
Yeah.
And you're like, so we aren't even asking our youth to explore their
Those
feelings
words.
through words.
Yeah.
Exactly. Like, language is changing. And musical theater continues to offer them that voice where it's like that melody, like Dear Evan Hansen, for example, like expressed to a generation like a mental health crisis in high school while being on social media. And there's a reason that it reached so many people. And so we noticed that all the high schools were tragically canceling the things that were going to improve kids' mental health. So, like, basically physical education and music. So they would still go to class for everything else, but we can't play a trumpet. I was like, are you kidding me? And then some teachers, bless their hearts, pivoted and they were outside or they had the covers or they worked their butts off to make it happen.
There's also the development of abstract thought is in the process in that time.
That's right.
And so the concepts that are so alluring to me, or that were to me and to Kara as teenagers for musical theater, was here's storytelling, which I always loved, TV and movies and whatever. Mix that with music, another thing that sort of transcends the normal, like, you hear
a melody can and the rhythm reflects, like, it speaks really deeply to your lizard brain, like that. It's a heartbeat plus a feeling without words yet.
Yes, and I think especially when you're a young person, I felt this way when I was a teenager, preteen, was that a lot of my identity came with the music that I listened to, and that was how I sort of found my way and identified myself. So I think when you, especially in musical theater, when you get that story put into words and you go, that's my story, it can be so healing or changing, stirring, whatever it is.
And you feel seen and you feel heard and all these sort of elements that can get you through. Maybe this is where I come into this postponement of ego, because, like, we're dealing with professionals all the time who are paid to do this, and cynicism can start to creep into the professional world, but it is absolutely absent from a high school musical, and they're going through hell. Like, emotionally, they have exams, and they're learning their lines for Mamma Mia or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So I'm like, it's the best. And so because they had lost all of that, we created the Manitoba Micro Musical Project for students. And this is where we were able to reach out to Brandon, to as far north as Dauphin. And, like, all of a sudden we had access to all these schools and teachers who wanted support to go digital, essentially. Right. And they could do whatever they wanted. And it was not product based. So they weren't... some of them eventually did, like, movie premieres where they, like, they put it on YouTube, and then they brought popcorn to everyone's houses, and then they all had like a premiere night over Zoom kind of thing, where others, people got to do monologues and express themselves from home. And then ultimately we had this girl in Brandon who, Kiara Tomeo, who wrote a song about losing the drama room. Oh my God. And it's one of the most beautiful, we should attach it to this because it's one of the most beautiful songs that I've ever heard. And she just walked through an empty drama room, and she just written this song expressing how it felt. She was graduating, and she's like, was she ever going to have this again? And it seems to be a safe place for a lot of kids. And that was the whole point of it. And then we were able to, in one of our other pivots, which was our Pot of Gold concerts, so that she closed the night. So we brought her out, and Paul DeGers composed her single piano and her single voice with a professional band of 6 and 6 singers backing her up. Oh my God, it was absolutely beautiful. And like, I don't know about you, Pablo, but it's honestly, we really mean it. If you can change one life, it was worth it.
Absolutely. I don't come from a musical theater background, but one of the things I've always known about musical theater that I think speaks to what Carson was talking about is this idea that when you don't have the words to name what you're feeling, you sing. And when singing fails you, you dance. And it's this incredible thing about how, as you were talking, the music and it connects to the emotion and it connects to the body. And I think that's one of the things that musical theater brings, just even in its structure, saying, yeah, this is a moment of singing, this is a moment of dancing. We're just feeling more and more as we go along, right?
What some of the larger changes were during the pandemic for your company specifically. So if you want to jump in on that would be interesting.
Yeah, and I know earlier I talked about the long game and how sometimes you're postponing something. I'm not naive about it. The first show we had to cancel was a show that was touring from Australia. And they were very smart. They saw what was coming, and they contacted every venue that they were visiting and said, we need to get back home because we think the border is going to close. And they flew back to Australia. So, and that show, the likelihood is, won't be touring internationally for another 3, 4, 5 years. So sometimes there are things that you lose. There's no denying that. But for me, it's about what the journey there is. I can tell you that after the end of that season, where we canceled the last 2 shows of the season, we had some really, really profound conversations with our staff about how we wanted to approach announcing the next season. And we made a choice to go towards what we called measured optimism. And it's that we were very transparent with families, with schools, that we were announcing all of these shows that we wanted to do, and that we would play it by year, month to month. And that's how we sort of weathered the first year. And yes, the truth is, most of it got canceled. We didn't really have anything on our stage. We went digital in some cases. We really leaned into developing some of our new work that was supposed to be in that season. It bought us that extra time to see it through. And I can tell you that particular piece, Frozen River, is now having a national tour this next season because of all of that additional time that was invested in it. So there's really, if you're looking for that silver lining, for those positive things to come out of it, it was the time to really invest in those pieces. And then when we came to the current season, or the season, I should say the season that just wrapped up, we said we took that measured optimism approach. We said everything we're going to do. I think audiences and artists have been very kind and generous and gone along for that on that ride with us for a year. I think we shifted at that point, and we said we are just going to look at discrete chunks, and it's partly connected to this notion that vaccines were being rolled out. So we said in the fall we'll go digital. We'll do an outdoor show in December. Yes, we did an outdoor show in December. And then we will, in the new year, we'll start opening the theater step by step, bit by bit. So that was sort of our journey through this past year. And you can see that beyond sort of the shifts from one show to the other, or going digital, or thinking of a new program, there were those fundamental discussions around, what do people need? We are in service of an audience. We're in service of our community. What do parents need? What do families need? What do teachers need at this point in time? I have 3 kids myself, and I knew what it was like to be homeschooling and all of those challenges. So we were always looking for, what is it that families need in this moment in time?
And I was an audience member for that outdoor December.
Oh, as
So
for
was
me,
Rui.
yeah.
It was a wonderful.
I agree.
time.
I think that was a super cool move, and it provided a safe place for people to experience the magic of what you do in what I think is one of the most beautiful places in our city. So good on you.
And if I may, Carson, here's the truth. That had been in my wish list from like my first year in Winnipeg.
Ah.
I went, I would love to do an outdoor show in the winter. It's silly, but probably shouldn't. But, it was on that long list of things. And then when we looked, because here's the other piece that is quite unique to MTYP, is that as we were having conversations with health officials, as we were talking to patrons, as we were talking to artists, the focus was always on adult audiences. And one of the things that we actually had to say to public health officials at a meeting was, what about those of us who work primarily for children? Because everything you're saying is based on a vaccination timeline for adults. And the answer we got is, add 3 to 6 months to everything we're saying, because it'll be a different timeline.
Wow.
So it was that piece around sort of that advocacy for children, which is really tied into how we work. But at the same time, sort of realizing, right, if we're going to do that, here's the perfect opportunity to do that silly outdoor show in December, because that's when we were expecting that we would just be starting to move into gathering again.
That's really interesting. I'm thinking about, especially because live theater sort of went poof for a couple of years too, is that you would both mention that for young audiences, your stages are a lot of is the introduction to theater for young audiences. And so have you noticed a difference in how children are reacting to theater now, those who may have not ever seen theater and grew up the first few years of their life in a pandemic or anything? Has there been a change, or does it feel sort of similar to what it was?
We were always the last theater to do anything. Like,
Right.
we were always, sometimes we were asked to lead the way in some respect because we had an open air venue and we felt like we could have audiences. But in terms of having a season, we're always sort of at the tail end of things. And so I would say that the kids, for example, that auditioned for the hockey sweater, we started that journey in January, and those kids, they've been back in dance, they've been back in soccer, they've been back in hockey, and the parents of those kids we're driving them to those things. They're doing them in masks, not masks, whatever, right? So they were ready.
Yeah.
They were so ready. And so the largest sort of amount of what would you say, like an obstacle to get over were generally with the older the audience or the artist was, to get over the hurdle of getting back out there.
Right.
So the kids were like, they were jonesing and ready to go.
Yeah.
And I don't know what it was like for you, Pablo. Like, I don't know when you're like, we ran our camps.
Right.
Both summers. So we ran Camp Roy Jabiv, which was like a 1-week camp for the all-star kids. And they were in 6-foot boxes and they weren't allowed to sing. So they basically rapped the whole.
Wow.
Yeah. Because they're like, they can talk, but they can't sing. And so they wrote a rap about how
yeah.
stupid that is.
Yeah.
And which is amazing, right? Like they have their feelings about it, and they always lead the writing of the song. So, and then the following year, camp was back in full force, sold out, and while other people weren't ready to go back to things, but sort of that was my experience. I don't know what it was like for you, Pablo.
Well, I can tell you that when I was talking about cancellations and shifting to digital, or all those changes we had to make, That was for our main stage programming. Our school continued to run all the way through the pandemic.
That's awesome.
And we had classes in person, sort of following the rules that they were implementing in schools at various points. Yes, we structured everything so that at a moment's notice, if the rules change, which they did, we could shift to virtual classes. So we were nimble that way to be able to stay in person, then as necessary, go, into virtual, back to in person. So I think that echoes what you were saying, is that I think children and young people really needed the theater. When I think of that song you were describing about, the empty drama room, they needed that sense of connection. And I think parents also needed to give that to their children. So I agree 100%. They were really wanting to engage that way.
Have you noticed in your audiences too of a difference in behaviors? Because I certainly remember returning to theater, and it was like, can we laugh?
Yeah, because you've been so used to kind of going at a screen for years that even being in a space where the actors are probably silently begging the audience to interact with you, you don't know if it's okay. You don't feel comfortable, especially a younger audience who've maybe never experienced it and their only experience is on a digital platform. How do you get people to interact with you again?
We have a generation of kids who lacked the experience of, I'm not a child, a child development therapist.
You're a grown person.
I'm not a child, but I'm also not a child, development therapist or anything. So I can't speak to what it means to have faces covered while you're developing your social skills. And then the second part is that, I don't think theater's ever at risk. I think when the zombie apocalypse happens, we're gonna in a cave do a play about it.
Yeah,
that's the first thing we're
to do.
Totally.
Of course.
And when the power goes out, what are we gonna do? We're gonna do a play. It's not going anywhere.
Yeah,
and however, but we are in direct competition with Disney Plus and Netflix and screens, and the fact that kids are handed phones at such an early age, it's disturbing.
Oh, yeah.
So the interaction of live theater with faces telling, so you're in a shared experience, whether you're going to laugh as a group, which is a sort of a magical thing, while real people stand on stage and pretend for you. It's a really ancient thing, right?
Yeah.
That I think we all connect with and don't necessarily have the words for. We were looking at, because our audiences here at Rainbow are in an outdoor venue seeing The Wizard of Oz or The Hockey Sweater. I didn't find a huge, I think because we were sort of the last to produce, it's
Right.
people were getting back at it.
Maybe this is intentional in both parts. I know that I've been to your shows, and one thing that I've noticed that I haven't seen before too frequently is the amount of direct audience to artistic director interaction that starts the show. And I've seen both of you speak at the beginnings of shows, introducing kind of what's going to happen in a way that is a little bit more inviting. Is that intentional, or is that part of this, trying to get audiences in? Is that just something you've been doing this whole time? That's just another question I have.
I will say, Cuinn, that's something we've always tried to do. I think I always believe that the work that I do cannot be done in isolation of the audience, and it's one of my opportunities to actually connect with the audience directly. So I don't know that has been an adjustment.
It is really wonderful to hear the positives that of coming back that didn't feel like such a challenge, at least in your particular cases.
It's also just nice to hear the positives of the pandemic, because I know we focus on the negatives because there were so many, but I think these pivots and these things that people were able to do and create during this time have made a huge difference in so many lives, and people who have not been able to experience theater ever are finally getting the chance, whether for financial barriers, geographical barriers, whatever it is, they finally get to experience theater and are being invited into a world that they didn't have access to. So I think It's been an interesting one. I'm not saying it was a good thing. I don't think it was a good thing.
Really?
I know.
Hot take.
The pandemic was bad. Let me get
That's why
that
I
out
don't even
there.
have-
Yeah. I mean, I'm confident based on how the Wizard of Oz is doing right now that in the years to come, we will be working the way that we used to work. And yeah, I mean, oh God, I have so much to say because it's like, you know, we're blessed to have gone through a global pandemic at a time where we had the innovation of what can keep us healthy, but also that we have heated homes and
Yeah.
cooled homes and the ability to chat with Pablo over this technology. Obviously, this is the best time in history to have gone through a global pandemic. But what I think the blessing was that, holy smokes, know what we learned is that this kind of interaction where we're seeing each other in a room together is really valuable.
Yeah.
Oh, a mask does what? You know, like we are like, it's actually getting us back in touch with something that may be far more ancient.
I would say MTYP is a little different because our model is predicated also on working with schools.
Right.
Like all the buses were canceled, right? Like kids didn't get on school buses.
There were no field trips. We're still waiting to hear whether schools are going to continue going on field trips. You know, like, and it brought about one of the strangest things I had to deal with in the pandemic. Our model is so predicated on working with schools that in our agreements, in our labor agreements, there are actually stipulations that so many of our shows have to happen during the daytime. And as opposed to other theaters where you can have a lot of evening shows. We normally do one evening show during a run of a play, and then we do a few weekend shows for families. But most of our shows are during daytime with schools coming into the theater. When there's no field trips, we were actually finding ourselves in a position where I never thought I would have to do the math on this of saying, how many shows do we have starting before 4:00? Because there's a ratio we need to meet, you know, which I would have never seen coming. But because we had to fundamentally adjust our business model, because the only opportunities that we had to interact with children and young people were through public shows, through family shows. So that's something else that's going to change quite a bit in the coming year, we hope, and we'll see. We'll see, because like the work that teachers have been doing in schools, you know, the last 2 years, Cuinn, you know it firsthand. You've been in those in school, and it's been Herculean, you know, and we're
Well,
hoping
I
that we can
mean,
support them now.
yeah.
Okay, maybe not you, Cuinn,
Yeah,
but you know,
definitely not me. But I've seen it. Yeah, I mean, I think that is good to hear, though. Like, I mean, that speaks to the adaptive nature of things. But then obviously there's in some cases you're moving back to some previous models when you're allowed to. But we are curious, what are things also that because you've highlighted some positives, what are things that you think that were positives that you want to keep and stick to that came out of innovation or adaptation because of a problem?
well, my board really wants me to do another outdoor show.
Yeah.
I love the outdoor show.
was really nice.
It was very
I
special.
really
Yeah.
liked the hot chocolate.
Oh yeah, and it was great hot
But
chocolate.
the show was really good too.
Hey, this is one of the joys of the work I do. We actually have a card, an old card from a student that said, or from a child who came to a public show, saying the show was really good, but the cookies were better.
Yeah.
So I'm used to that. Don't worry, Sharon. No, beyond the outdoor show, I think, you know, digital access to programming. We had, and by that I mean like our school programming. We had children who, you know, for whom it would be too long of a drive to come to Winnipeg to take a class, who started to tune into classes. I think that was a really positive thing. We also have to be aware of some access concerns. There are immunocompromised children for whom like that personal interaction that we love may not be the best path for them. So those are some of the things that we're keeping as well. But I do need to do my bit on digital theater for you, just because this seems like the right time. So my wife has a problem with dairy. So here's my thesis. Digital theater is like vegan cheese. By all accounts, the vegan cheese that Carrie is having these days is significantly better than the vegan cheese she was having 5 years ago. However, she will tell you it's not close to the real thing.
Yeah.
So we need to stop pretending that vegan cheese is the same as cheese. But the world does need vegan cheese, because otherwise people like Carrie will never be able to have cheese.
Of course.
So in a way, for me, that sort of that somebody called it that forced marriage with digital that theater had, during the pandemic. It may not be the thing that we're after with the experience of being in theater, but it does open up some doors for people who wouldn't be able to experience theater anyway. And I think that's one of the big takeaways for me when I talk about digital classes and digital programming. That's where one of the things that I think we would continue doing.
Right. I think that's. I mean, I love the analogy also, because it really is. We often are just pretending that it's something that it isn't, or that we're taking a show that's meant for a stage and we're adapting it. It's like seeing the Mona Lisa on a JPEG isn't the same. And so I think I maybe here's let me continue with your food analogy. So I don't eat beef, and but I love burgers. I love burgers. And if I try and have like an Impossible patty, it's trying to imitate beef, but doing a worse job at it. It's not bad. It's fine. It tastes good, in fact. But if I have like a chicken burger or a black bean burger or something like that, it's made for being what it is. And I think one thing that I've noticed is there's theater that is a little bit more like the chicken burger or the black bean burger that's starting to develop, in that it's not theater that was written for stage adapted to Zoom. It's theater that is meant to be what's the word? Digitized or multimedia-tized.
You don't have to add ties to
I think you do. And those are really good tized pieces of art, because it's when you instead of trying to solve a problem by making an adaptation, instead writing something meant for that. If you see a program that's written as a Zoom call, for example, I know it's not necessarily thinking way outside the box, but then at least you're getting it in its best medium, or its intended medium.
Yeah. I mean, I can't add much more to that exquisite answer. We're holding on to the same things. That the digital outreach is really important to us. We worked hard not to try. I mean, we're actually incapable of putting a musical on digitally because, I mean, the rights of alone or putting your actors into actor contracts or whatever. It was never possible. Right. So this space that we're creating for you to have conversations like this is something we want to continue. Like one of the things that we realized with Hockey Sweater is that we could reach way more, we could remove the barriers for auditions that like auditions are scary. Yeah. Obviously kids have to be really brave to come out. Generally, those are kids who are already dancing at a dance school and they're doing recitals in front of people. And so you can tend to fall into having the same kids all the time coming out, and that's great. They're amazing humans. But what we were able to do on Hockey Sweater is take our auditions into the community and do that both digitally and physically. And I don't think we're gonna stop doing that, because that's how you can say hi to people in a way that makes, I don't know, that's the first step. Yeah.
You found some stellar kids. So,
oh my God.
So it really worked out.
Brilliant kids.
I know, they make you feel like the world's going to be okay, right?
But seeing those kids, they're like, whoa.
I know.
Like, those kids are, whoa. Next level. You're like, oh, there's the future. Like, not even the future, there's the now.
I want to see them again.
Exactly. I'm intimidated. No, it is like a wonderful, wonderful thing to see that that sort of like broken down barrier to entry. Because that's another huge thing in this sector, is there is a barrier to enter for a lot of reasons, including the financial one is maybe, I don't want to call it the largest, but off the top of my head, it's probably the largest one. But there's also like barriers in programming and barriers in like essentially, to put it plainly, getting butts in seats that aren't your typical subscribers. Is there something that you are particularly excited about in terms of, because I mean, talking to both of you or seeing the mandates and the new changes to the companies, I know those are goals that both companies have sort of at their forefront is lowering barriers to entry, essentially. Are there things that you're excited about, particularly moving forwards, as well, that you're doing, or steps that you're taking to lower those barriers or to remove them altogether?
One of the first things that I was able to do with the team here is expand our Manitoba First mandate, whatever, however that we describe it, but that was to include writers, composers, and authors. So it was primarily who was on the stage, and so we were able to have success with Danny Shore's musical strike, and also success in the public funding area to bring that 100-year-old story into the 21st century.
Right.
And so they went back into it with support from underserved communities to bring new voices into it. And then the show. So we were in discussions with the National Arts Centre to take Strike to Ottawa, which is very exciting for us. And I was like, I don't know how to do that because I just started. And so I contacted a company in Edmonton who I had had been in the show that went to Ottawa. And the first thing he said was, well, you have to build in cost to pay for the show. And he was like, so how much do you owe on it? And I was like, what do you mean? And he said, like, well, how much did you lose when you did it the first time? And I was like, oh, no, we didn't. Like, we have 2,000 seats. And if you sell enough tickets, you can pay for the scale of the musical. Like, these are not cheap. They're enormous budgets. But because of our unique venue, we were able to do a Canadian musical that paid for itself. That was a game changer, and gave me the confidence. And this sort of the positive thing throughout the pandemic was to like get into the nitty gritty of the company and go, can we have this balanced programming value that I inherited, right? So it's like, what does that mean? It was never, was it jukebox musical and it's book musical? It was never defined. But what if balanced programming is Hockey Sweater and The Wizard of Oz, right? And so that we can start commissioning musicals from, so we have to do two things, right? We have to keep telling stories that exist in a culturally inclusive way, so that, because representation matters as you're welcoming in new audiences that you want kids to see themselves on stage. And then, but we also need culturally specific shows. And so like we have 2 or 3 in the works. One that's very public, which is Mabuhay, and which is being written by Joseph Civillo. And that's very, very exciting for us. And for the aim for it to be on our stage, not to put it in a separate venue where the local shows go. You know what I mean? We will do that from time to time, depending on the size of it. But the scale that he's writing, that's Broadway scale. And and so we also have a new commission coming out for something that we could do in the winter. And but they're all going to be born of our community. And I think that's something that I feel like my predecessors have built the stepping stones to get there. Like it's not something that was like an aha moment for me. It's like we're finally there.
And, that's very exciting.
This might sound very strange coming on the heels of what Carson said about sort of redoubling and redefining the commitment to Manitoba First. Just harkening back to the previous question, one of the things that we learned and that we're going to keep doing is that the development of new work actually can happen digitally, which actually frees you up to a much larger roster of artists you can work with. If you were doing a couple of days of development on a show or a week of development, most of the time you wouldn't be bringing in a designer, a director from out of town. Well, maybe this can happen now, right? Or even if it's not about a specific work, I'm in conversations with companies around the world about work that they're creating And it's not just about that particular work that they're creating, but what is the possible collaboration between MTYP and that company to create a new work in the future. So that's also been an interesting shift, which is different from what Carson's talking about, but at the same time, it's a reality of what we've learned over the last 2 years.
The cross-pollination of communication and art is still important. And like the pandemic has made every city very regional. It was like it did force every A house to become acquainted with their community,
Yeah.
which I would say has been a problem across the country. Is that like if you're, I don't know, I don't want to speak, I won't name a theater, but you can be the big house in a capital city in Canada and an entire community that's never worked there.
Yes.
And very common because they're generally, again, like even ADs are brought in from out of town and they want to work with people they know. And so I think one of the positives has been like, oh, hi, who are you? And what can you do for our company over the next few years? And I think there's going to be like more of that kind of cross-pollination is sort of the best term I have for it in terms of, and it's important because otherwise we won't be talking to each other.
The other piece that I will mention is MTYP always tries to do one international show every year. And that for me, beyond sort of the exposure to audiences of shows that we normally wouldn't see in Canada, for me artistically too, it's really interesting to see how people create work for young audiences in other parts of the world. Like a show like Doodle Pop, which came from South Korea, doesn't get created that way here. There's a different sensibility to the work. Or, when we had the Dutch theater dance company that was doing acrobatic things that I can't even conceive of, a few years ago. And again, that show probably doesn't get created in the same way in Canada. And I think that's also stimulating. And if you can involve your local arts community in that conversation, it might open up other ways of creating work, which I always find really exciting.
The model of theater for young audiences being way more universal than you could ever imagine is really what the treat is there, where the access point is so low and the quality is so high simultaneously. It's really, really special. So I highly recommend. I know the listeners to this probably go to Rainbow Stage. Highly recommend Rainbow Stage. But
they should go to Rainbow Stage. They should go to Rainbow Stage, right?
Of course, they should go to Rainbow Stage. Yeah,
please go to Rainbow Stage.
Yeah, I think I'm just reading my contract. Please go. Just joking. But
you guys just hit your contractual obligation for saying Rainbow Stage.
Rainbow Stage.
At least
49 times.
In a single podcast.
The light has gone off, so we're good. But it is important to also note, like, MTYP as a company sounds like a company for children, and mandated it is in a way a company for children. But there has not been a point where I haven't been intellectually stimulated or thoroughly entertained or my jaw has dropped quite literally at things that I just haven't seen done before.
I always say that I have the blessing of always having worked in theater for young audiences. And I say the word audience is built into what we do, right? Like, Rainbow Stage, musical theater, but we're like theater for young audiences. So this consideration of audience is built into who we are. But I also want to echo what Carson said earlier, that, with shows like The Wizard of Oz or The Hockey Sweater, you're bringing in people who may not have had an experience in theater before, and you're trying to introduce them to that idea of what is it like, in Rainbow's case, to be with 2,000 other people having the same experience and responding to it together. So I think that's why it makes perfect sense that both of these theaters would always have a consideration for programming for an audience, understanding what it is.
This is an interesting thing to me from the position of programming, because another thing that happened in the pandemic was this massive political shift in that we all started paying a lot more attention to social dynamics, political dynamics. Maybe not all. I can't say that. I know a lot of people, myself included, I love politics, and I love the idea of like activism and social change and things like that. Something I've been invested in for a long time. Sometimes more necessarily than than for others. But what I'd say is, there was with this massive shift. I'm sure there was on your parts. There's outside pressure then additionally to do this, and this. Is there consideration, or did there feel like pressure to do now? Oh, do the show about reconciliation now. Do the show about Black Lives Matter now, in a way that I'm not sure that necessarily how much it like affects, but I'm sure that pressure has to be there, or at least a little bit present, when it comes to programming now with all this like social stuff. Is there an audience now saying like, you have to do some like socially edgy stuff or whatever, even if that flies in the face of what a mandate is?
When you said, I wonder if people ask you questions, and it's like when people ask questions, I say, do you know the work that we do? I'm happy to tell you about the work that we've been doing for decades. Not to say that there's no learning, not to say that there's no recalibration, to say that the last 2 years have not changed fundamentally how we see and feel about certain things. That would be folly, right? Like it has. But really, for a theater that is focused on children and young people and reflecting their lives, and that has a focus on access, this work has been ongoing for a long time. So you said, like, did you shift? Did you do the play about reconciliation now? That play was in development before the pandemic, right? Because it was something that is so built into the lives of young people that it's unavoidable. And that play, Frozen River, is sort of the second iteration of a collaboration between writers who did a similar work for even younger audiences in 2012, right? So you can see that the track record of this work is shows that the work has been ongoing, I think.
I have a different answer than Pablo's, because although the work had been a part of the national conversation for as long as I can remember, and Rainbow Stage was confronted with realities that just were not in my field of view,
Right, yeah.
and our board's field of view, it was I would say that the political landscape that I was using my, how would you put it? Like, what would you call this role? Like I'm stewarding and advocating. Sure. Thank you. Yeah. This platform that I have, the staff will know that I was advocating for gender parity. And this is coming from my wife, who's a feminist and has been, women weren't legally people 100 years ago, and 400 years ago in a direct line of colonial theater weren't allowed on the stage. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It was this, like, I could see it. It was in my field of view, and I wanted to participate in changing that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then this cultural shift, this political shift, these discussions were like earth-shattering for our community, for communities across Canada and across the United States. And so for Rainbow, we had a lot of work to do. And like, although those discussions had been happening, it was like, really, what are we doing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's that's why I mentioned earlier these two kind of focuses, which are about representation in the titles that are going to be going up on stage, sort of regardless, based around all of these, all of the discussions we've had around programming, right?
Right.
And then, but it was fascinating to discover that the majority, if not all, musicals that were representing underserved communities and people of color were either based around trauma and then on top of it, written by white people.
Yeah.
So although that was probably the progressivism of that time,
Right.
Sure.
it's
Yeah.
like, well, what time are we in now?
To be fair, like it's ever changing, and I think maybe that's what you're speaking to a little bit of. Like, there's a lot of things to consider.
Tons.
Right?
And what I love about what we do, if we tell the right kind of stories, it will bring people to the theater that maybe didn't feel welcome before.
No, I just wanted to respond to what you said earlier, Carson, about, Rainbow has a lot of work to do. So does NTYP, so does every theater in the country. Because the work of overcoming oppression will never be done. Right? And I think when you touched on it, that the lines will move and they should move. And that work will be ongoing, which doesn't give us an excuse to say, well, if it's never going to be done, let's stop doing it. You have to continue to engage with it. And I think that has been the thing that theaters have realized in this time. It's that this is a long-term commitment. It's not about the next 2 years. It's not about the next 5 years. It is about an ongoing commitment to overcoming oppression in whatever form may be manifesting at that point in time.
This long game is correct, right? But it can't be the excuse to be like, well, that's why we're not doing it now.
Right.
Too-
But there's clear, like, it sounds like there's clearly short steps to that long game that are
exactly.
in place, right? While it's not the achievable outcome, I think as Pablo discussed, like, the achievable outcome by the time you get to it isn't going to be the achievable outcome
it's
anymore.
now
It
going to
is
keep
ever,
moving
like,
forward.
And,
Yeah,
and, it,
yeah,
should,
yeah,
and it
right?
should be, right?
Yeah.
Final question, lightning round. What?
4, 27.
What is the most exciting thing happening in theater right now? Could be local, could be across the world, could be. You could do past or present. I said right now, but I'll open it up.
I will say that if we circle back to the topic of this conversation, we've rediscovered how nimble theater can be. And I think artists have rediscovered how nimble they can be as well. And I think there's something really exciting about that being applied to the work moving forward.
It's about those kids in hockey sweater, right?
Yeah.
Like they are the most exciting thing to me.
Yeah.
And they're young. They're between 8 and 15, and they're having these difficult conversations in their dressing rooms. Like they are the future.
Yeah.
And the High School Musical's coming back. Like I can't wait to go. I can't wait to see the next generation and to do what we can to build a path for them to share their voice. And I mean, it's like, honestly, like they're everything to me.
Yeah.
So
That's incredible.
yeah.
Wow, what a beautiful note to end
Yeah,
on.
I think that
Yeah.
basically ends it here for all of us here at
Rainbow
Rainbow
Speaks.
I want to thank you two. Your rapport, your love for our community, your intelligence, and the way you listen. This is really amazing. And I want to thank Daphne and Dutchess.
Yes,
Yes,
thank you,
for
our
the-
dream team.
Dream team back there.
Well, really, all of you. It's 2 years ago. I don't know if I ever could have imagined that this would be happening, and so I'm very grateful. Thanks,
and
Pablo.
thank you for inviting me.
Yeah.
And my toss to you is that this episode should be called Rainbow Speaks and empty YP coughs.
Oh, very nice. I love it. Thank you to Pablo. Thank you to Carson. I'm Cuinn Joseph.
I am Kara Joseph.
And this has officially been
Rainbow Speaks.
Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Rainbow Speaks. Our hosts are Cuinn and Kara Joseph, and today's special guests were Carson Nattrass and Pablo Felices-Luna. For the digital studio, I'm Daphne Finlayson, your technical creative director, and our content creative director is Dutchess Cayetano. Music for the show is provided by Duncan Cox. This podcast was recorded and produced on Treaty 1 territory, the traditional home of the Anishinaabeg, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Metis Nation. We gratefully acknowledge the support of the Canada Council for the Arts in making this podcast possible. Thank you so much.